South Florida again takes center stage this week in the ongoing and multi-layered issues around processing, absorbing, or deporting a spiking number of migrants.
This week, we learned that 2,500 migrant teens being held at the detention center in Homestead no longer are going to get to take classes, play soccer, or other sports, and they will stop getting attorneys to represent them and protect their rights. The Department of Health and Human Services says they've got to cut those programs because they are simply running out of money. They're already spending about $750 a day for each teenager at that detention center. That's more than $2 million a day to house, feed, provide basic medical services, and try to place those kids with family members or sponsors.
3 South Florida members of Congress, all Democrats, denounced the cutbacks in services at the detention facility, and one of them is calling for the resignation of the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Alternatively, the House passed this week a bill granting a path to citizenship for the Dreamers and others in the country with temporary protected status. That bill passed with almost unanimous support of Democrats and 7 Republicans.
And one of those Republican yes votes was cast by our guest, Representative Mario Diaz-Balart. He is a Republican who has served in Congress for the last 17 years. He represents the 25th Congressional District, much of Southwest Miami-Dade, Hendry, Collier counties, much of the Everglades. Congressman, good morning.
A lot of alligators in that district.
Good to see you all. Good to see you all.
A huge district. We will get to this whole developing story on tariffs and immigration, but first about the Homestead Detention Center. The fact that the announcement this week that these kids down there will not get classes in English or anything else, can't play soccer, that all these activities to keep these kids occupied are being cut out.
And that's unfortunate. But the reason, it's not that anybody wants to cut them out, it's because they are running out of money, as you all just mentioned. And they are running out of money because the Democratic leadership in the House has refused to add any funding for it. And so remember that for a long time they were saying that this is a fabricated crisis, Well, now everybody understands that it's not a fabricated crisis, it's a real crisis. Right. We need to put money not only for the detention centers, but that's a big part of it. And unfortunately, the Democratic leadership has, and some on the more radical left of the Democratic members of the House, some have also refused to put any money.
Let's talk money for a moment, because at this particular facility that you've been in,
I have,
in Homestead, $750 per detainee per day. Correct. Is what is being spent here, which we've learned is so much more than the per day dollar amount at smaller shelters, the nonprofits that are run. And there is a huge outcry that this is a for-profit contracted facility. And so if you would, Congressman, speak to the fact that the detention center in Homestead, where it's so expensive, ramping up to 3,200 beds in the coming months, is a for-profit facility. Why is it a for-profit facility, and how can profit not be a motive for filling it up?
Well, look, the reason it's being filled up is because these individuals have to be placed someplace.
As opposed to somewhere else.
As opposed to somewhere else. But this is a large facility that's been there. By the way, it's been there. This is not a Trump administration facility, as you know.
Right.
Number one. Number two is, look, I've been there. They provide, frankly, very, very important, a very important service. They do so in a way that is safe. They provide education, schooling, healthcare. Yes, that's all exceedingly expensive. And so here's the problem. Whether it's this facility or other facilities, they're all having to cut back because of lack of funding. And so I repeat, there were some that said that there was no crisis, there was no increase in the numbers. That has been shown to not be the case. Yeah. If you have so many new folks coming in the system with no additional money, this is not rocket science, Glenna. Something's going to have to give. Obviously, it can't be safety. It can't be the safety of these children, so therefore it's going to have to be their leisure activities, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, Congressman, you were 3 congressional colleagues from South Florida. Yes. Debbie Mukersel-Powell, Donna Shalala, Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Money for them is not the issue. They think there should be more money to be able to provide these programs. So who is holding this up and why? What do they want in return?
I'm very careful. I don't talk about Democrats or Republicans, but when you're looking at the Democratic leadership in the House, because I'm on the Appropriations Committee, as is Debbie Wasserman Schultz, by the way, and she does a phenomenal job there. We work very closely together. But we have not gotten the Democratic leadership to agree to put any sufficient additional money to deal with the numbers, the increased numbers of folks coming across the southern
Let's
border.
put the number on that. 144,000 migrants in May.
That we know of.
Okay, well, that I found on the graph.
Correct.
Is more than double of any month in the past 5 years.
Correct.
And 30% more than April. So there is a number that is really shocking.
Right.
That said, let's talk about the detention center inside. I've been there. You've been there. The three congresswomen have all been there. The Flores attorneys for the Flores agreement, this 20-year-old agreement that sets the standards for care, they've been there. And the reports out of there are shockingly different. Prison-like system, kids abused and neglected. Is that what you saw?
No, it's not what I saw at all. Now, look.
And for the record, I did not either.
Right,
not that it's a great situation, but
that's right. Look, and the thing is this: if there's one instance of abuse, it's one too many. And so, but what you see in the facility here in Homestead are kids that are being treated well. Is it the place that you and I would want to be, our kids to be there? No, these are kids that are in detention, obviously, but they are treated well. They're they're also given all these other activities, whether it's healthcare, whether it's actual activities, whether it's education, which I think is a good thing. Unfortunately, when you have the numbers growing at the rate that you just showed, and yet the Democratic leadership and some members of the Democratic Party saying that that was not true, well, something has to give. What do we have to do? We have to fund the detention centers. We have to fix the situation on the southern border. And by the way, I will tell you, the administration, I have disagreements with the administration, but I think they're pressuring Mexico, as they're doing now, is the right thing to do. Because what is not true is when the Democratic leadership and some on the left were saying that this was a created crisis. It's a real crisis. They've refused to put the money, and now we're going to see the consequences of that refusal if we don't act soon.
Well, I'm not an attorney, but let's say I will stipulate to the crisis. I think anybody who opens their eyes and looks at the situation on the border knows it's a crisis. Now, on Friday, the president announced, after hard negotiations between Mexico and the United States, that his 5% tariffs would not go into effect tomorrow, Monday, and that Mexico was going to agree to really try to act aggressively to stop the huge amount of migrants who are coming across their southern border. But then the New York Times reports today that those agreements have been in place for a couple of months. That this
they haven't been but they haven't been enforced, and so it's an issue. Look, there's nothing new here. There's none of these issues are brand new, and so with the administration, I will tell you, I agree with them on some foreign policy issues. I agree with them on how they're pressuring China. And it seems to have, it's having the results, hopefully, that we want, which is to curtail some of the problems that we've had with China, and that's a bigger issue. They're now pressuring Mexico to do what has been agreed to by Mexico for now some time, but they haven't done.
So some of the things that are in the agreements are Mexican National Guard at the border, 600,000 eventually, tightening Mexico's border with Guatemala, and what's interesting is accepting more asylum seekers from Central America in Mexico, although I think, I'm reading that Mexico's asylum system is fairly broken. But then this morning, the president had a little bit of a tweet storm this morning, and among his tweets talked about something that hasn't been talked about as part of that agreement. Do you know what that is? I
don't. I'm not, I'm not involved in the details of those negotiations. What I think is important is for the United States, when you have, and Mexico's an ally, it's a business trading partner of the United States, frankly a very important one, it's important for our economy. But one of you mentioned, for example, some of the issues that are broken. Asylum. The asylum system is broken to the point where those who really have legitimate asylum claims can't get here through that process because the lines are so long by folks abusing the process. And so I like the fact that the administration is pressuring, in some cases, our adversaries like China, and in some cases, our friends and our allies like Mexico to adhere to some of the things that they've said that they were going to do in the past to make sure that we protect those who are seeking asylum, who need asylum, but also to stop some of the abuses. And the abuses, when you're dealing with the folks crossing the border, particular, who are the biggest victims? Are women, are girls. You ask folks, what percentage of young girls are sexually abused trying to get to the United States, and the number would astonish all of us and what they have to go through. So again, we have to remember that there are real victims. These are not numbers. So when folks say there's not a crisis, you're right, Michael, there is a crisis. There has been a crisis. This president is trying to address it. I don't always agree with how he addresses all these things, but he's trying to address it. And in the case of Mexico, it looks like they're finally starting to respond.
All right, hold on. We've got more questions, including questions about the future of Venezuela.
Yeah.
So stick with us. We'll be back with Congressman Diaz-Balart after the break. Welcome back. We are speaking this morning with Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart, Republican from the 25th District. Congressman, the impasse in Venezuela continues between Juan Guaido and Nicolas Maduro, but this weekend, Maduro opened the bridges, the border to Colombia. Hundreds of thousands, apparently, Venezuelans went over to buy the medicine and food they cannot buy,
right,
at home. So where does this go from here? Will the humanitarian aid that was stockpiled over the last couple of months, will that be able to move into Venezuela?
I'm hoping it does. Look, here's the interesting situation. So you have Maduro, who controls guns but doesn't control the country. You have Guaido, who doesn't control any guns, but who walks around freely in the country while Maduro's locked up in a base. And so this new reality of the last 5 months, is it an impasse? I don't think so. If you look at what has happened in the last 5 months.
But Guaido hasn't been able to bring down Maduro,
That's
and Maduro
correct.
hasn't been able. If he arrested Guaido, then the Lima group, then there would be a huge ramification.
I think if he arrested Guaido or did anything like that to Guaido, President Trump has been very clear. This administration has been very clear that Guaido's safety is a national security issue of the United States, and therefore, I think that would be the last mistake that the Maduro folks make.
Congressman, this week, in an effort to keep Cuba out of Venezuela,
Right.
the administration cracked down on cruises, on travel, and that was a big upheaval on both sides of the water. And so you favor that. You've been consistently hardline in the policy against Cuba. And so my question to you is the backlash on U.S. businesses and U.S. travelers, which by the statistics does not make up a huge portion of business to Cuba. Is that something that is worth what happened?
Look, it is, because the law is very clear, which is, in the first place, what is the policy of this administration? Deny funds to the dictatorship in Cuba, that, by the way, is using those funds to repress its people and to also do bad things in places like Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia, and elsewhere. And so that's the policy. I think it's the right policy. The law has always been that way. Under the previous administration, they basically pushed the envelope of the law, saying that cruise ships are not tourism. Now look, that doesn't pass a straight face test. And so this administration is in essence enforcing the law. The purpose of the policy of the law is to deny as much as possible funds reaching the regime, and these tours, when they get there, particularly the tours that were arranged on the ground, are all involved with the regime. So therefore, it's good policy, and it shouldn't surprise anybody.
So look, can we just drill down into that, Philip? There are there's essentially 12 categories that
Correct.
Americans can travel, and the people-to-people category, which a lot of opponents called the sham from the beginning,
Correct.
is what has been eliminated, and that's why the cruises have been eliminated.
Correct.
But there is still a category called support for the Cuban people category.
Right.
What's the difference?
If you can, for example, not deal with the regime. So one of the things that the law allows for is if people want to go there to help to meet with the ladies in white, they can do so. If they want to stay in places that are not controlled by the regime, they can do so. Unfortunately, a lot of these people-to-people travel groups have been arranged on the ground through entities that are associated with the regime. The hard currency has gone to the regime. That is precisely the kind of thing that is bad for our national security interests. It's bad for the hemisphere like Venezuela and Nicaragua. And by the way, frankly, it's against the spirit, if not the letter of the law.
Yeah. Congressman, the Miami Herald, immediately after the new policy was announced, ran, I thought, a very strong editorial supporting the Trump administration on this. And it said, among other things, we think the new restrictions will send a stinging message that will get Cuba to realize there is a price to pay for its interference in the Venezuelan crisis. Do you think the Cuban government, do you think that they will get this message and change, move out of Venezuela? I don't think so.
The regime is the regime, right? We know it. It's the same regime that's been there for 60 years. The question is, what is better for the national security interests of the United States, and what is better for the Cuban people? To help fund that regime with hard currency, or to try to make it harder so that that regime cannot pay for its repression and it cannot expand and export that repression?
Yeah, well, let's put up on the screen. I just want people at home to understand how large this is exactly. According to John Kavalich at the U.S.-Cuba Trade Economic Council, in 2018, about 800,000 U.S. citizens were passengers on cruise ships. That's really an impressive number. And each of those visitors, the cruise ships paid, cruise line companies, paid the Cuban government $8 per visitor. And the aggregate total, as Glenna said earlier, is estimated between $67 and $103 million, which is not chump change, but you know, it really is. How much money is this for Cuba and for the regime?
Yeah, it's also the fact that a lot of the tours on the island, a lot of those
run by the government,
a lot of those, or run by either the regime or those associated with the regime. But again, this is the key. Look, what's better for the national security interests of the United States, for the people of Cuba, and for the Venezuelans who are now suffering because of the 20 to 25,000 Cubans, to help fund the regime that's doing all those horrible things, or to deny hard currency to that regime? Yeah. Clearly, in our national security interests, for the interests of the Cuban people and of the Venezuelans and Nicaraguan people and the Bolivians, it's better to deny hard currency to the regime that's using those funds to do bad things.
So why then?
So you would, just one follow-up if I could. So if Richard Fain from Royal Caribbean called you up and said, hey, Mario, come on down and talk to me, and you're willing to sit down with him or people from Carnival or MSC or the other cruise lines and say, we're sorry, you got in bed with a dog and you got up with fleas. Is that sort of the theory?
I have a great relationship with these folks. I think you mentioned Mr. Fain. You know, I'm a huge admirer of Mickey Arison, who's always been exceedingly sensitive to the cause of Cuba. But I think they would tell you that early on, when they started looking at doing this, I told them, I said, look, I understand that the Obama administration is pushing that, but the law does not allow it, and you're kind of betting that President Obama is going to be in the White House forever.
Bet. Yeah.
And it's unfortunate because, look, I don't want people to get hurt. I don't want businesses to get hurt. But whether it's doing business on stolen property of Americans, or whether it's doing business that helps fund, give hard currency to an anti-American, terrorist, narco trafficking regime that is doing bad things around the world and this hemisphere in particular, that's not what they should be doing. I understand why they did it. They got a lot of pressure, by the way, by the previous administration to do it. But again, the law is clear and the policy is the right policy.
And the airlines, American airlines that fly there, why are those different?
Yeah, because the administration has decided, and by the way, the law is also that family travel to visit relatives is permissible. And therefore, they've determined that that's the way they can do it. I would tell you, however, that those airlines have to be very careful to make sure they're not doing business on property that were stolen from Americans, because if they were, they're probably going to get sued.
Right, and there is, of course, a family that says, we used to own the airport in Havana, so that suit, I think, has been filed, or soon will be.
And there will be, I think there are going to be other suits, but I remind people, if they're not doing business on property that was stolen from Americans, they have nothing to fear.
Congressman, great to have you.
Can I just my heart goes out to the entire family and Todd's family for that horrific, sad loss.
The outpouring has been amazing.
Well, he was just a wonderful, loving, warm. Last time I was here, by the way, I ran into him, and he was always the way he was.
Special guy.
You're right.
Special guy.
All right, Congressman, thanks very much.